Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for January 24th, 2023. Well, in a discussion yesterday, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and leader of the Schiller Institute, called for an all-out mobilization to build for our conference coming up on February 4th, titled The Age of Reason or Annihilation of Humanity. And there's a registration form for this linked at the bottom of the description section. Here's what she said. Quote, "We're in a countdown," she said, "of either getting a break to a better new paradigm or the danger that this thing goes completely wrong, horribly wrong," unquote. Contrary to the flippant idiocy of Boris Johnson and his NATO sponsors, there are red lines, and you'll see what I mean in a moment, that once crossed, there is no point of return. Now, Johnson went to Kiev yesterday on an unannounced visit, and he issued an extremely provocative statement. He said, "This is the moment to double down and to give Ukraine all the tools they want." And of course, the Ukrainians have been begging for more weapons, offensive weapons, air defense systems, tanks, and so on. BoJo denounced Chancellor Scholz for resisting the demands that the Germans provide the Leopard tanks to Ukraine. He stood up to the pressure at the Ramstein meeting, but the pressure is escalating. Now, Johnson himself, a week earlier, advocated crossing the red line. Go ahead and take the risk, he said. In his view, he said that there's a low probability of a nuclear attack. Now, are you willing to risk your life on the judgment of Boris Johnson? So he's encouraging actions which would increase the probability of a nuclear exchange. This was backed up by the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock from the Green Party, who has demonstrated again and again that she is one of the spokesmen for the war party in Germany. And she said Germany would allow Poland to provide German tanks if the Poles asked for it. Now, Johnson's message to Kiev was the same one he delivered last April when there was a prospect of a negotiated settlement. "Escalate, don't negotiate," he said. "We'll give you everything you need. Just don't give in to the threats. Continue the war." Johnson is a promoter of a permanent war to weaken Russia, which is the same thing that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has proposed and Baerbock from Germany. So the question is, why is NATO being egged on by the Brits being so recklessly provocative? Now, it's not just that the military-industrial complex wants the dollars for weapons. That, of course, is a given. But there's another factor here. The fear that a new multipolar order is emerging just in the immediate future. Now look at the situation in the West. You have debt that is unpayable, inflation, insolvent corporations and bankrupt governments, collapsing infrastructure. Yet they're still demanding that nations surrender their sovereignty to sustain the unipolar world. The neoliberal order run by the central banks on behalf of the private financial institutions and corporate cartels, at the threat of irregular warfare, coups, assassination, or actual warfare by NATO countries if you don't submit. That's the threat coming from the West. Not very attractive, is it? Especially after the West has proven that they're willing to steal your money, as they're trying to do with the $300 billion they seized of Russian reserve assets. Now, what's the alternative? Well, there's a new system emerging, and this was expressed in a statement from Putin over the weekend at the Eurasian Economic Union Summit. He called for pooling the efforts for development in science and technological sectors. And he said others are welcome to participate, and he mentioned Egypt, India, Iran, Indonesia, and the United Arab Emirates. Also, you have the BRICS, the BRICS Plus, which is expanding. There was an important session yesterday between the president of Argentina, and the new president of Brazil, Lula. The South Africans are very much involved in this, as was clear from Sergei Lavrov's trip there earlier this week, and the fact that Janet Yellen is today in South Africa trying to convince the South Africans to stick with the United States rather than the new emerging order. Now, one of the spokesmen for the Eurasian Economic Union, actually the chief economist for them, Sergei Glaziev, made a very clear statement in the last couple of days. He said, quote, "All more or less sovereign countries have stopped accumulating reserves in dollars and are rapidly switching to settlements in national currencies," unquote. He called for the, quote, "creation of a new international settlement currency instead of the current IMF reserve currencies." Now, this is the time, he added, to, quote, "jump off the sinking ship of the dollar-centric debt economy," unquote, and move to a new system which funds economic development and mutual trade. This was the intention put forward many years ago by Lyndon LaRouche in his arguments for the establishment of a new Bretton Woods, fulfilling the goals that Franklin Roosevelt outlined at the end of World War II, which were sabotaged by the Brits who moved in after Roosevelt's death and grabbed Harry Truman by the throat and got him to establish, or weaken, I should say, the idea of the Bretton Woods Agreement. The Bretton Woods Agreement was still a decent agreement for development, but was chipped away at and sabotaged and finally trashed by Richard Nixon in 1971 at the urging of Wall Street bankers such as George Shultz, Paul Volcker, and others. Now, LaRouche's new Bretton Woods idea is being kept alive and expanded on by people like Glaziev, who recently praised LaRouche as the world's leading economic thinker. So the February 4th conference that the Schiller Institute is sponsoring gives us an opportunity to move away from the desperate moves by the collapsing Anglo-American empire to a new system of cooperation for mutual benefit among sovereign nation states. This is LaRouche's idea: credit for production, credit for science and technological innovation, and funding for education, for healthcare, for infrastructure, especially at the front ends of technology. That's how you create new wealth, not by endlessly printing money to cover over worthless and unpayable and uncollectible debts. Now, in thinking about this, keep in mind what John Kennedy said on June 10th, 1963, at his famous speech at American University. Here's what he said, quote, "Nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adapt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world," unquote, John F. Kennedy. This was after he had made a decision to move toward establishing an ongoing dialogue with the Soviet Union in the aftermath of the near-nuclear war that developed around the Cuban Missile Crisis. So don't submit to the suicidal demands coming from the crazies like Boris Johnson and Blinken and the NATO establishment. There is an alternative, and you can join it by taking part in our conference. We saw at Davos with the World Economic Forum trying to rally support for a system which is collapsing, for policies which won't work. We have to put that out, get rid of that, and move toward this new system. So join us on February 4th, and I'll be back again tomorrow.